People believe catastrophic betrayal arrives with screaming arguments and shattered glass. But the most devastating destruction often enters a marriage through a sentence delivered with terrifying calmness. I stood inside the warm yellow lighting of our Atlanta kitchen, clutching a tiny, white baby onesie that read Future Architect, while Derek Harper leaned silently against the marble counter with a glass of bourbon resting in his hand. Outside, the February rain slid slowly down the windows of the 4-bedroom suburban house we had built together over 6 carefully managed years. My heart was pounding with nervous excitement as I placed the ultrasound photo beside the wrapped gift bag and waited for the reaction I had imagined for weeks during sleepless nights and quiet morning commutes. Derek opened the tissue paper with mechanical slowness, his expression never softening. His eyes moving from the tiny onesie to the ultrasound image with the detached calculation of a man reviewing a legal contract rather than learning he was about to become a father. I laughed softly because the silence felt too strange to be real. But then he placed the ultrasound back onto the kitchen island with frightening precision and said in a cold, measured voice that immediately drained every ounce of warmth from my body, "That is not my child." The words landed with such brutal certainty that my mind rejected them entirely for several seconds. I searched his face for confusion, for anger, for pain, for anything remotely human. But all I found was a terrifying emotional emptiness that made me realize this moment had not surprised him at all. It had merely accelerated something he had already decided long before I walked through the front door. True emotional collapse does not resemble dramatic cinematic breakdowns because the human nervous system initially refuses to accept the scale of devastation occurring around it. By 9:17 p.m., I was sitting alone inside my freezing Honda Accord in the parking lot of a 24-hour Kroger, 2 miles from the only home I had known for 6 years. The heater hummed weakly against the sharp Atlanta winter air while families pushed shopping carts through puddles beneath fluorescent lights, completely unaware that my entire life had just been surgically removed from beneath me. Derek had watched me pack a single overnight bag without offering 1 ounce of hesitation or regret. He had not yelled. He had not argued. He had simply repeated that he knew I had been unfaithful and that he wanted me gone before the situation became legally complicated. That phrase echoed violently through my head as I sat gripping the steering wheel with trembling fingers. Legally complicated. Not emotionally painful, not heartbreaking, not devastating, but complicated, like I was an inconvenient liability, requiring immediate removal from an otherwise efficient financial operation. I checked my banking app and felt another wave of panic flood my chest when I realized most of my savings remained inside our shared account because Derek had convinced me years earlier that centralized finances were smarter for tax planning purposes. My laptop, my architectural files, my insurance documents, my passport, everything important remained locked inside the house behind a man who had just looked at his pregnant wife with the emotional detachment of a corporate attorney preparing a hostile acquisition. The human mind has an extraordinary ability to reinterpret warning signs as harmless irregularities when preserving emotional stability becomes more psychologically convenient than confronting danger directly. Sitting alone in that dark parking lot, I suddenly remembered every strange conversation Derek had initiated over the previous year regarding my first husband, Thomas Caldwell. Questions that had originally seemed random and harmless now rearranged themselves into something disturbingly deliberate. Thomas and I had divorced over a decade earlier after 4 relatively peaceful years together. There had been no scandal, no betrayal, no children, only the quiet realization that we wanted different futures. He moved to Portland and founded a software company while I rebuilt my life in Atlanta and eventually married Derek. I had not spoken to Thomas in more than 10 years. Yet Derek had brought him up repeatedly during the previous months with almost clinical curiosity disguised as casual conversation. "Whatever happened to that tech guy you married before me?" he had asked one evening while pretending to scroll through his phone. Another night, he jokingly wondered whether Thomas had become one of those billionaire Silicon Valley weirdos living on private islands. At the time, I interpreted the comments as ordinary male insecurity. But now, inside the freezing silence of the Kroger parking lot, I understood something horrifying. Derek was not jealous of Thomas emotionally. He was investigating him financially. And the realization arrived with enough force to physically tighten every muscle in my chest as I opened my phone browser and typed Thomas Caldwell's name into the search bar for the first time in over a decade. Certain moments divide your life into 2 irreversible categories: the person you were before receiving specific information, and the person forced to exist afterward, carrying knowledge that permanently alters reality itself. The search results appeared slowly beneath the glow of my cracked phone screen, while rain tapped softly against the windshield. Thomas's software company had been acquired 3 years earlier by a massive international technology investment group. The exact sale amount remained undisclosed, but every article describing the acquisition used phrases like strategic expansion and landmark transaction, terms corporate journalists reserve for deals involving extraordinary amounts of money. My stomach tightened as I continued scrolling through outdated interviews and archived business profiles until I reached a short obituary published 5 months earlier in a Portland business journal. Thomas Caldwell dead at 47 following a sudden stroke. I stopped breathing for several seconds while staring at the article because the realization felt almost impossible to process. My ex-husband had been dead for 5 months and I had never known, but something even more disturbing emerged beneath the grief and shock. If I could discover this information in less than 15 minutes sitting inside a grocery store parking lot, then Derek absolutely could have discovered it months earlier, especially considering his obsessive recent interest in Thomas's financial status. Suddenly, every strange withdrawal from our joint account, every late-night phone call in the garage, every calculated emotional distance began aligning into a terrifying pattern that pointed toward a single unbearable conclusion. My husband had not thrown me out because he believed I cheated on him. He had thrown me out because he believed something valuable connected to Thomas Caldwell was about to reach me. Real survival begins the moment emotional devastation transforms into analytical clarity, because panic may protect you briefly, but structure is what ultimately keeps you alive. I spent the remainder of the night drifting between shallow bursts of exhausted sleep, inside the driver's seat before driving at dawn to a 24-hour diner near Peachtree Street where construction workers and exhausted nurses occupied quiet booths, beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. I ordered coffee and eggs I could barely swallow while writing a list across the back of a gas station receipt with hands that still shook intermittently from shock. First, I needed legal representation immediately before Derek manipulated our finances any further. Second, I needed access to the house under legal supervision to recover my documents and professional equipment. Third, I needed independent health insurance because my pregnancy changed every practical consideration surrounding survival. And fourth, most importantly, I needed to understand exactly what Derek knew regarding Thomas Caldwell's estate, because instinctively I already understood that information represented the center of this entire disaster. Architects are trained to identify load-bearing structures inside complex systems. We learn to distinguish decorative elements from foundational realities capable of carrying catastrophic pressure. And somewhere between my second cup of coffee and the gray winter sunrise illuminating the diner windows, I realized my marriage itself had always been partially decorative. The real foundation underneath Derek's behavior had never been emotional intimacy or partnership. It had been strategy, leverage, and opportunity management disguised beneath suburban normalcy. Once I recognized that truth, something inside me stabilized with terrifying precision, because structures become easier to survive once you finally understand how they were built. The most dangerous people in high-functioning society rarely appear unstable because genuine predators understand that professionalism itself can function as an incredibly effective camouflage mechanism. Claire Sutton's office occupied the 14th floor of a polished glass tower in Buckhead overlooking downtown Atlanta. She greeted me wearing a navy pantsuit and the calm, emotionally disciplined expression of someone who had spent decades listening to human disasters without allowing herself to drown inside them. I told her everything from the pregnancy announcement to the accusation to the parking lot to the strange obsession Derek had developed regarding Thomas Caldwell. Claire took notes silently for nearly 30 uninterrupted minutes before finally asking me to log into our shared banking account using her office tablet. The moment the balance loaded across the screen, my stomach collapsed completely. The account previously holding over $31,000 now contained less than $500. Derek had transferred nearly everything out less than an hour after forcing me from the house. Claire's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes sharpened instantly with the cold focus of an attorney recognizing deliberate financial misconduct. She explained that Georgia courts took marital asset dissipation seriously, particularly during pregnancy and pending divorce proceedings. But then her posture shifted slightly when I described Thomas's recent death and Derek's growing curiosity regarding his estate. She leaned back slowly in her chair and said something that permanently changed the direction of my thinking. Megan, if your husband believed you were about to inherit significant money from a deceased former spouse, removing you from the marriage before formal notification could become strategically advantageous in his mind. The room suddenly felt much colder as I realized another professional besides myself had independently reached the exact same horrifying conclusion. There are conversations capable of reorganizing your entire understanding of reality within less than 60 seconds because certain truths carry enough gravitational force to pull every surrounding memory into a completely different shape. After leaving Claire's office, I sat alone inside my car, parked beneath the concrete levels of the Buckhead garage, and called Rachel Caldwell, Thomas's older sister, whose number I eventually located through social media after nearly an hour of searching. Her voice sounded older and softer than I remembered, yet immediately recognizable. When I introduced myself, there was a long silence, before she quietly explained that Thomas's attorneys had spent months attempting unsuccessfully to locate me regarding unresolved estate matters connected to his death. My pulse accelerated violently while she provided the name Gordon Reeves, a Portland estate attorney managing Thomas's trust holdings. I called his office immediately, and after several transfers, a measured professional male voice informed me that Thomas had indeed named me as a beneficiary inside a revised trust completed 8 months before his death. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached while Gordon carefully explained that the inheritance involved multiple liquidated technology assets, real estate holdings, and investment accounts collectively valued at approximately $77 million. The number itself felt physically unreal, too large to emotionally comprehend sitting alone inside a parking garage wearing yesterday's clothes after sleeping inside my car. But before I could fully process the scale of it, Gordon added one final detail that transformed shock into pure terror. Someone had apparently been attempting unofficial inquiries into the trust months earlier through indirect channels connected to Atlanta-based financial contacts. And in that exact instant, every remaining doubt disappeared completely, because I finally understood with absolute certainty that Derek had known about the inheritance long before I did. Psychological manipulation becomes most visible during moments when controlling individuals suddenly lose certainty regarding their own power over the situation. 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy accompanied me back to the house north of Atlanta, after Claire successfully established my legal right to retrieve personal belongings from the jointly mortgaged property. The February air smelled faintly of rain and cut grass as I walked through the familiar front door carrying empty storage boxes while Derek stood silently near the staircase wearing a charcoal sweater and the same emotionally blank expression he had perfected during our marriage whenever genuine honesty threatened to surface. His mother, Linda, sat at the kitchen table observing everything with unsettling composure. She looked immaculate as always, with perfectly arranged silver hair and pearl earrings, positioned like symbols of controlled aristocratic femininity. Yet beneath the grandmotherly elegance, I sensed something cold and intensely calculating, tracking every movement I made through the house. Linda had never openly disliked me during the marriage. Instead, she specialized in subtle diminishment delivered through polite social calibration. Tiny comments questioning my workload, my fertility timeline, my independence, all disguised as concern. But standing inside that kitchen now, I recognized her differently. Not as an unpleasant mother-in-law, but as an active strategic participant inside whatever operation had been unfolding around me for months. Because while Derek watched me collect legal documents and hard drives without speaking, Linda finally smiled faintly and delivered a sentence so calmly manipulative it made my skin physically tighten. "You're making a terrible mistake, Megan," she said gently. "Families survive difficult misunderstandings all the time." And hearing her frame deliberate financial betrayal as a misunderstanding revealed more truth than any confession ever could. When your previous life collapses completely, the human mind begins searching desperately for environments untouched by betrayal, because geography itself can temporarily resemble emotional safety. 4 days later, I boarded a flight from Atlanta to Portland, carrying only one suitcase, a legal folder, and the nauseating awareness that my entire future now depended upon understanding the true scale of the deception surrounding me. Gordon Reeves met me inside a towering downtown law office overlooking rain-covered streets and guided me through hours of trust verification paperwork while carefully explaining Thomas's final revisions to the estate. According to Gordon, the updated documents specifically protected the inheritance from marital claims provided the funds remained isolated inside accounts inaccessible to any spouse. Thomas had apparently become increasingly private after selling his company and had revised his trust after expressing concerns regarding opportunistic people attempting indirect contact through business intermediaries. Hearing that detail sent another wave of cold realization through me because it confirmed Derek and Linda's investigations had likely extended much further than I originally imagined. After signing the preliminary beneficiary documents, Gordon handed me a sealed envelope written entirely in Thomas's handwriting. Inside was a brief letter explaining that despite the years apart, I had remained the only person he ever fully trusted, not to love him for financial potential. I sat silently inside the conference room reading the words repeatedly, while rain streaked the windows behind me because suddenly the tragedy became larger than inheritance or betrayal. Somewhere during the years we spent separated, Thomas had continued believing I represented honesty in a world increasingly dominated by calculated transactions. And meanwhile, I had unknowingly married a man willing to psychologically destroy me over money connected to another person's death. People accustomed to controlling others through intimidation frequently underestimate how rapidly fear transforms once victims fully understand the system operating against them. The threatening call arrived 3 days after I returned from Portland, while I was staying in the spare bedroom of my closest friend Jess's apartment in Midtown Atlanta. An unfamiliar male voice informed me with careful politeness that architects relying upon professional licensing should avoid public legal disputes capable of generating unnecessary ethical scrutiny. The message itself remained deliberately vague enough to preserve plausible deniability, yet unmistakably threatening in tone. My pulse quickened violently at first because pregnancy amplifies every emotional response into something physically consuming. But beneath the fear, another realization emerged almost immediately. Desperate people make reckless mistakes, and this call represented desperation. I calmly informed the man that Georgia allowed one-party consent recording and requested his full name for my attorney's documentation. The line disconnected instantly without another word. Claire filed a harassment motion the following morning, and by afternoon, Derek's legal team suddenly requested mediation regarding asset distribution and confidentiality agreements. The speed of their reaction revealed exactly what Claire suspected from the beginning. Derek and Linda were terrified not merely of financial consequences, but of exposure itself. Because wealthy social ecosystems rely heavily upon reputation management and carefully maintained public narratives. And if evidence emerged showing Derek had orchestrated the emotional removal of his pregnant wife after secretly researching her deceased former husband's inheritance for months, the damage would spread far beyond divorce court into every business relationship he possessed. Master manipulators rarely abandon emotional performance entirely because strategic warmth remains one of the most effective weapons ever developed for controlling vulnerable people. Linda arrived at Jess's apartment on a rainy Sunday morning carrying homemade cookies packaged inside an elegant white bakery box that looked absurdly harmless considering the circumstances surrounding our meeting. She sat gracefully inside the small living room, speaking in soft, sympathetic tones about family healing, stress, misunderstanding, and forgiveness while carefully avoiding direct acknowledgement of the inheritance itself. According to Linda, Derek still loved me deeply. The pregnancy had frightened him emotionally, and the legal conflict was becoming unnecessarily destructive for everyone involved, particularly the unborn child. Every sentence was delivered with surgical precision designed to trigger guilt rather than suspicion. But then I asked a single direct question regarding the anonymous phone call Rachel Caldwell had received from an alleged journalist investigating Thomas's estate shortly after his death. And for less than 1 second, Linda's entire facial expression shifted. The warmth disappeared instantly, revealing something cold, predatory, and intellectually ruthless beneath the grandmotherly mask. She recovered almost immediately, yet the damage was already done because I finally saw the authentic woman hidden underneath decades of cultivated social elegance. When I informed her that my attorney possessed extensive documentation regarding the financial transfers and inheritance investigations, her tone hardened noticeably and she leaned forward, slightly before delivering a sentence that sounded less like advice and more like strategic warning. "You have absolutely no understanding of the people you are fighting against," she said quietly. And strangely enough, hearing those words no longer frightened me, because by then I understood something equally important. Neither she nor Derek fully understood me anymore either. The collapse of carefully maintained deception rarely occurs through dramatic confession, because most sophisticated lies unravel gradually beneath the unbearable weight of documented evidence. During the discovery phase, Claire obtained access to financial records, phone logs, and archived communications stretching back nearly 2 years through subpoenas Derek's legal team fought aggressively, but unsuccessfully, to suppress. The resulting documentation constructed a devastating timeline, revealing systematic surveillance of Thomas Caldwell's financial trajectory, beginning almost a full year before Derek accused me of infidelity. Browser histories from Derek's work laptop showed repeated searches regarding the acquisition of Thomas's company, Oregon estate procedures, revocable trust structures, and beneficiary protections under Georgia divorce law. Meanwhile, Linda's phone records confirmed multiple lengthy calls to Portland numbers connected directly to Thomas's surviving relatives only weeks after his funeral. But the most catastrophic evidence emerged from a private email Derek had sent his attorney 5 days before, throwing me from the House stating plainly that the situation needed resolution. Before the Portland attorneys established formal contact with M, reading those words inside Claire's conference room produced an almost surreal emotional calmness, because the final uncertainty disappeared completely in that moment. My husband had never believed I cheated on him. The accusation itself had been a calculated operational maneuver designed to isolate me psychologically and financially before information regarding Thomas's inheritance officially reached me. Derek entered the deposition room 3 weeks later, wearing an expensive gray suit and the exhausted expression of a man slowly realizing the architecture of his deception was collapsing beneath him piece by piece. And when Claire placed the printed email onto the polished conference table asking whether he recognized the message, I watched the precise second he understood he had already lost everything. The psychological destruction of powerful individuals rarely begins when they lose money because wealth can usually be rebuilt. It begins the moment they lose control over the narrative they spent years carefully constructing around themselves. Derek sat rigidly beside his attorney inside Claire Sutton's conference room, while the deposition recorder captured every silence and every evasive answer with merciless precision. Sweat glistened faintly near his temples despite the aggressively cold air conditioning circulating through the office. Claire's questions became increasingly surgical as she walked him through the timeline connecting Thomas Caldwell's death, the inheritance investigations, the bank transfers, and my sudden removal from the house immediately after announcing the pregnancy. Derek repeatedly attempted to retreat behind carefully rehearsed phrases like misunderstanding and marital instability, but the documentary evidence surrounding him had become too structurally complete to escape. Finally, Claire produced the prenatal DNA test, confirming he was unquestionably the biological father of the child he claimed could not possibly belong to him. The silence that followed was so dense it almost felt physical. Derek stared downward at the polished walnut table while his attorney slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes with exhausted frustration. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I witnessed genuine fear, replacing arrogance inside Derek's posture because he finally understood the situation was no longer a private marital dispute capable of manipulation. It had transformed into documented evidence of deliberate fraud, emotional abuse, and strategic financial misconduct that could permanently infect every aspect of his professional reputation. People attempting to avoid public accountability frequently disguise desperation as generosity, because admitting weakness directly would require emotional honesty they are psychologically incapable of sustaining. 11 days after the deposition, Derek's legal team delivered a revised settlement package exceeding 20 pages accompanied by language carefully designed to appear cooperative rather than panicked. According to the proposal, Derek would formally relinquish every possible claim to Thomas's estate, return the full amount removed from the joint account with interest, transfer majority ownership of our marital home and investment portfolio, and finalize the divorce without contest regarding custody arrangements or support obligations. However, buried deep within the settlement language remained one familiar condition that immediately exposed the true purpose behind the negotiations. A comprehensive confidentiality clause permanently prohibiting discussion of the circumstances surrounding our separation, or any business activities connected to the inheritance investigations. Claire laughed softly after reading the document, because experienced attorneys recognize fear instantly when it appears disguised as diplomacy. Derek was not attempting to preserve money anymore. He was attempting to preserve social survival. Commercial real estate depended heavily upon elite networking ecosystems where trust and image functioned almost as valuable as financial liquidity itself. If clients, investors, and board members discovered he had strategically discarded his pregnant wife after secretly researching her dead former husband's inheritance for nearly a year, the reputational damage would metastasize through Atlanta's business community with catastrophic speed. I stared through the windows of Claire's office, watching gray clouds drift above downtown traffic, while realizing something unexpectedly liberating. The people who once terrified me were now negotiating from a position of absolute panic. The most revealing evidence inside any deception operation usually exists not within dramatic confrontations, but inside small financial details people assume nobody will ever carefully examine. 2 days after receiving the revised settlement, Claire's forensic accountant uncovered a secondary investment account opened secretly under Derek's name approximately 8 months earlier using funds partially siphoned through multiple shell transfers connected to our joint assets. The account itself contained more than $200,000 along with extensive communications regarding speculative property acquisitions. Derek intended to pursue independently after finalizing the divorce. However, the truly devastating discovery involved several private messages exchanged between Derek and Linda discussing anticipated access to future liquidity events once my emotional instability justified separation proceedings. Reading those words sent a cold wave through my entire body because suddenly the timeline expanded far beyond what I originally imagined. They had not simply reacted opportunistically after learning about Thomas's death. They had actively strategized around dismantling my marriage months before I ever announced the pregnancy. My emotional trust had been transformed into a long-term financial calculation, conducted quietly behind closed doors while I continued designing buildings, attending dinner parties, and believing I existed inside a fundamentally safe marriage. Jess found me sitting silently at her kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the printed account statements while rain hammered against the apartment windows. She placed a mug of tea beside me and asked softly whether I regretted uncovering the truth. I considered the question carefully before answering because honesty demanded acknowledging something painful. Ignorance had once felt safer, but safety built upon lies eventually collapses under its own structural weakness. Human beings frequently reveal their authentic nature most clearly during accidental encounters, occurring outside carefully controlled environments, because spontaneity removes the protective architecture surrounding performance. I encountered Derek unexpectedly inside the lobby restaurant of an upscale Buckhead hotel while meeting Claire for lunch regarding revised custody documents. He stood near the bar speaking with two commercial investors whose faces I vaguely recognized from previous charity galas and networking events attended during our marriage. The moment his eyes locked onto mine, every visible ounce of confidence drained subtly from his posture, although the investors remained unaware enough to continue discussing property developments and market conditions. Beside him, for several painfully awkward seconds, we simply stared at one another across the polished marble floor while soft piano music drifted through the restaurant. Then Derek excused himself from the conversation and approached my table with measured caution, like someone attempting to approach a wounded animal without provoking violence. He looked thinner than before, exhausted around the eyes, his expensive suit hanging slightly looser against his frame. And when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the cold authority I once associated with him entirely. "Megan, I never wanted this to become war," he said quietly. The statement itself was almost laughably absurd considering the scale of manipulation surrounding us. But what truly unsettled me was the flicker of genuine regret briefly surfacing beneath his exhaustion. Not regret for hurting me emotionally, but regret for miscalculating strategically. Because deep down, Derek still viewed relationships through transactional frameworks where outcomes mattered more than morality. And standing there watching him attempt vulnerability like a businessman negotiating damaged assets, I finally understood something essential. He had never truly known how to love another human being without simultaneously evaluating their economic potential. Grief becomes infinitely more complicated when affection continues arriving from someone long after death itself has already closed every opportunity for reconciliation. One rainy evening, Gordon Reeves forwarded scanned copies of additional handwritten letters Thomas had left within the trust archives, specifically instructing they be released gradually over time, depending upon my emotional circumstances during the settlement process. I sat curled beneath a blanket inside Jess's apartment, while reading page after page filled with Thomas's uneven handwriting describing the loneliness that followed, his company acquisition, and the increasing difficulty of trusting anyone once money entered every interaction. He admitted regretting our divorce repeatedly, despite understanding why it happened, explaining that I represented the only relationship in his adult life untouched by performance or financial ambition. But midway through the second letter, another revelation emerged that made my stomach physically tighten. Several months before his death, Thomas hired investigators after receiving unusual inquiries regarding the trust structure from unidentified Atlanta intermediaries, attempting to determine whether former spouses retained beneficiary status after divorce settlements. According to Thomas, the inquiries frightened him enough to accelerate revisions protecting my inheritance from external interference. Tears blurred my vision while I continued reading, because suddenly the tragedy deepened into something almost unbearable. Thomas had attempted to protect me from danger he recognized before I even knew it existed. Meanwhile, the people inside my own marriage were quietly engineering the exact exploitation he feared. Outside, thunder rolled softly above the city, while I pressed the letters against my chest and realized grief was no longer connected solely to death itself. It was connected to wasted time, missed warnings, and the devastating knowledge that one man valued my integrity more deeply after divorce than another ever managed during marriage. Elite professional. Environments operate according to invisible information networks where reputational collapse spreads. silently through whispers long before public acknowledgement ever occurs. Approximately 3 weeks after the deposition, Claire informed me through barely concealed satisfaction that rumors regarding Derek's legal situation had begun circulating aggressively throughout Atlanta's commercial development community. Apparently, one of the investors present during our unexpected hotel encounter had withdrawn from a pending property partnership after learning fragments of the inheritance scandal through mutual legal contacts. Suddenly, Derek's previously stable business relationships started deteriorating with alarming speed as lenders delayed approvals. Associates stopped returning calls promptly, and several board members requested internal reviews regarding financial transparency concerns connected to his ongoing litigation. I should have felt triumphant watching the empire that once intimidated me begin fracturing publicly. But the reality felt far more emotionally complicated, because witnessing another human being unravel psychologically, even after betrayal, still carries uncomfortable weight when you once loved them deeply. Derek called repeatedly during that period, leaving increasingly emotional voicemails, alternating between apology, frustration, self-pity, and desperate attempts to justify his behavior as temporary panic triggered by overwhelming pressure from Linda and financial stress. However, every explanation ultimately collapsed beneath one unavoidable truth. He had looked directly into the eyes of his pregnant wife and intentionally destroyed her sense of safety for strategic advantage. No amount of later emotional vulnerability could structurally repair that reality once it fully existed. And somewhere during those weeks, I stopped mourning the marriage itself, because I finally accepted something painful, yet freeing. The relationship I grieved had never entirely existed outside my own hopeful imagination. Individuals who maintain dominance primarily through emotional discipline often become extraordinarily dangerous once their control mechanisms begin failing publicly. Linda arrived unannounced at Claire's office late one afternoon, demanding a private conversation despite explicit legal instructions prohibiting direct contact outside formal channels. Security cameras later captured her pacing aggressively through the reception area, wearing an immaculate cream-colored coat while speaking rapidly into her phone with visible agitation unlike anything I had previously witnessed from her carefully managed persona. When Claire eventually permitted a monitored conversation, Linda abandoned every trace of grandmotherly warmth almost immediately and accused me openly of orchestrating a campaign designed to financially destroy her son out of greed and revenge. She claimed I manipulated Thomas emotionally years earlier, manipulated the courts currently, and manipulated public sympathy through the pregnancy itself. The venom inside her voice shocked even Claire, whose career exposed her daily to hostile divorces and strategic cruelty. But then Linda made a catastrophic mistake driven entirely by uncontrolled anger. She admitted possessing awareness of Thomas's trust revisions months before Derek removed me from the house. The room fell silent instantly because the statement effectively confirmed intentional premeditation regarding the inheritance investigations. Linda realized her error almost immediately, yet the damage was irreversible. Claire documented the conversation thoroughly while Linda stormed from the office, visibly trembling with rage. Later that evening, sitting alone on Jess's balcony watching Atlanta traffic shimmer beneath distant storm clouds, I recognized another crucial truth about power. Truly dangerous people often destroy themselves eventually, because arrogance convinces them they are intelligent enough to control every variable indefinitely, and reality inevitably punishes that kind of overconfidence. Sometimes healing does not arrive through dramatic emotional breakthroughs, because trauma rarely resolves itself cleanly. Instead, recovery often begins through tiny physical reminders that life continues expanding quietly beneath devastation. I was driving home from a prenatal appointment during a soft April rainstorm when my daughter moved for the first time inside my body. The sensation felt delicate, yet undeniable, like gentle fingertips tapping against glass from another world entirely. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot and sat motionless, gripping the steering wheel, while tears finally arrived with overwhelming force after weeks of relentless legal strategy and emotional suppression. For months, my existence had revolved around survival, documentation, attorneys, financial records, betrayal, and structural collapse. But in that small, silent moment, everything narrowed suddenly into something profoundly simpler and infinitely more important. There was a child depending upon my stability now, a little girl completely innocent regarding the warfare surrounding her conception, and realizing that shifted something foundational inside me because revenge no longer mattered nearly as much as protection. I rested both hands across my stomach, while rain drifted softly across the windshield, and promised her silently that whatever happened next, she would never grow up, questioning her worth based upon another person's manipulation. The world outside remained chaotic and uncertain. But for the first time since the night Derek expelled me from the house, I felt something stronger than anger beginning to emerge beneath the wreckage: purpose. Sophisticated lies eventually collapse beneath repetition, because maintaining deception requires perfect consistency, while truth survives naturally without rehearsal. The final deposition occurred 6 weeks later inside a larger downtown legal office due to the expanding complexity of financial discovery surrounding Derek's business holdings and inheritance investigations. Multiple attorneys attended along with forensic accountants and court reporters documenting every statement with exhausting precision. Derek appeared emotionally depleted from months of mounting legal and professional consequences, yet still attempted occasional evasive maneuvers whenever questioning approached Linda's direct involvement regarding Thomas's estate. However, the strategy disintegrated completely once Claire introduced copies of Linda's phone records alongside archived emails discussing anticipated liquidity opportunities connected to my potential inheritance. Derek's attorney objected repeatedly, but even he appeared increasingly hopeless as the documentary structure surrounding the case became impossible to dismantle logically. Finally, after nearly 4 brutal hours, Claire asked the single question that transformed the atmosphere inside the room entirely. "Mr. Harper, did you knowingly accuse your pregnant wife of infidelity despite possessing no evidence whatsoever, because you believed doing so would emotionally destabilize her before notification of a significant inheritance?" The silence stretched unbearably long while Derek stared downward at folded hands resting against the conference table. And then quietly, almost inaudibly, he answered yes. Nobody moved for several seconds afterward because even within high-conflict litigation, genuine admissions of calculated emotional cruelty remain profoundly disturbing to witness directly. I watched him carefully while court reporters typed rapidly beside us and realized something unexpectedly sad. The man sitting across from me had sacrificed his marriage, reputation, finances, and inner peace chasing money that was never truly his to begin with. Extreme wealth carries a strangely disorienting psychological effect because the human mind struggles to emotionally process numbers large enough to fundamentally alter every practical fear you once carried. The first official transfer from Thomas's trust arrived on a quiet Wednesday morning. While I sat alone inside Jess's kitchen reviewing revised architectural proposals for a future boutique design firm I hoped eventually to launch independently. My phone vibrated softly against the table, displaying confirmation that nearly $8 million had entered the protected trust account Gordon established under Claire's legal supervision. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling almost detached from reality because despite everything surrounding the inheritance, the number itself still felt abstract compared to the concrete experiences of fear, humiliation, and survival preceding it. Jess screamed loudly enough to startle the neighbor's dog after reading the confirmation over my shoulder. But strangely, my first emotional reaction was not excitement. It was exhaustion. Deep, overwhelming exhaustion releasing months of relentless tension all at once. I walked onto the apartment balcony breathing slowly while Atlanta traffic drifted beneath the afternoon sunlight and considered how bizarrely fragile human security actually is. Weeks earlier, I slept inside my car believing my life had ended financially and emotionally. Now I possessed resources capable of reshaping generations. Yet neither circumstance altered the most important reality emerging from this disaster. Money itself had never truly represented the core issue. The real battle centered around dignity, autonomy, and refusing to allow manipulative people to define my value through their greed. The official ending of a marriage rarely feels cinematic, because emotional closure cannot be generated through legal paperwork, no matter how comprehensive the settlement language becomes. The divorce finalized on an unusually bright Thursday afternoon inside a quiet Fulton County courtroom where exhausted attorneys shuffled documents beneath fluorescent lighting while strangers waited nearby to dissolve their own fractured relationships. Derek avoided direct eye contact almost entirely during the proceedings except once briefly. When the judge confirmed paternity findings, establishing him unquestionably as the biological father of our unborn daughter, shame crossed his face visibly for the first time since this ordeal began, and despite everything, a small, painful part of me still recognized the man I once believed capable of building a life beside me. But recognition no longer resembled trust. When the judge finalized asset distribution and officially dissolved the marriage, an odd silence settled inside my chest rather than triumph or devastation. Outside the courthouse warm spring, air carried the scent of fresh rain and traffic. Exhaust while reporters lingered discreetly across the street. hoping for photographs connected to the increasingly publicized inheritance dispute. Claire hugged me tightly before leaving for another hearing, and Jess immediately insisted on buying celebratory tacos from a nearby food truck, despite my complete emotional exhaustion, sitting on a concrete bench downtown eating tacos. Beside my closest friend while commuters rushed past without noticing us, I suddenly started laughing uncontrollably because the absurdity of life itself finally overwhelmed me. 6 months earlier, I believed happiness meant maintaining a perfect suburban marriage. Now freedom looked like sunlight, street noise, legal finality, and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of rebuilding myself completely from the ground up. Human beings survive catastrophic betrayal not because pain disappears permanently, but because eventually they learn to build new emotional architecture capable of carrying the weight honestly. 8 months later, my daughter, Ellie, sat bouncing inside a small chair beside the windows of our newly renovated Decatur home while morning sunlight spilled across hardwood floors and unfinished architectural sketches spread across the dining table. The house itself required enormous restoration when I purchased it, but something about the cracked walls and neglected garden felt strangely appropriate after everything. That happened because healing rarely begins inside perfection. My independent design practice now employed 4 people, including Jess part-time managing operations between her own consulting projects. Thomas's inheritance remained protected carefully through trusts and long-term investments, yet I still woke every morning determined to build something meaningful separate from the money itself. Derek maintained scheduled visitation respectfully, although our interactions remained emotionally distant and tightly structured through legal agreements. Linda vanished entirely from our lives following the settlement and subsequent investigations into several questionable financial activities connected to Derek's business accounts. Sometimes during quiet mornings while holding Ellie against my shoulder, I still replay that freezing February night inside the Kroger parking lot, wondering how close I came to psychologically disappearing beneath fear and manipulation. But then my daughter laughs, or sunlight reaches across the kitchen floor, or a client approves a design I created independently. And I remember the most important lesson hidden beneath all the destruction. The people who attempt to control you are always counting on your uncertainty regarding your own value. The moment you truly understand your worth, their entire structure begins collapsing from the inside out. The most devastating human betrayal is not the lie itself. It is the terrifying realization that the liar expected your emotional dependence to permanently override objective evidence. The prenatal DNA laboratory occupied the 19th floor of a sterile medical tower overlooking downtown Atlanta. Claire Sutton sat beside me in a charcoal gray suit while Derek remained across the conference table with his attorney Stuart Pell, his fingers tapping an impatient rhythm against the polished walnut surface as the genetic specialist entered carrying a sealed envelope that suddenly felt heavier than the entire architecture of my collapsing marriage. The fluorescent lights above us emitted a low electrical hum that intensified the pressure building inside my skull. The doctor opened the report carefully and stated with clinical precision that the probability of paternity exceeded 99.9%. Derek Harper was unquestionably the biological father of my unborn daughter. The silence that followed did not feel victorious. It felt radioactive, because Derek did not react with relief or emotional reconciliation. Instead, his jaw tightened with visible panic, as though the confirmation had destroyed a strategic calculation he had desperately needed to survive. And in that exact horrifying second, I understood that the accusation of infidelity had never been emotional at all. It had been a premeditated legal maneuver designed to isolate me before Thomas Caldwell's inheritance could legally stabilize around my future child. Corporate predators often mistake temporary intimidation for permanent structural control. But once financial manipulation is exposed to legal daylight, every concealed calculation begins decomposing with astonishing speed. Claire immediately requested that the DNA findings be entered into the official settlement discovery record, while Stuart Pell attempted to delay the filing under the excuse of procedural timing. Derek's expression remained unnaturally rigid, as if his nervous system had detached itself from his body in order to preserve operational control. Outside the conference room, Atlanta's skyline glowed beneath a layer of silver rain clouds, while traffic crawled through the city like veins carrying exhausted blood. Claire leaned toward me and whispered that Derek's entire credibility had just been catastrophically damaged, because a judge would now interpret his earlier accusations as deliberate bad faith conducted against a pregnant spouse. The implications spread far beyond emotional cruelty. His financial transfers, his attempts to remove me from the house, and the harassment campaign targeting my professional license could now be legally interpreted as coordinated coercion. Derek suddenly interrupted the meeting and demanded a private conversation with me in the hallway. But when we stepped outside the conference room, his composure fractured for the first time since the night he expelled me from our home. His eyes carried not remorse, but desperation as he quietly admitted that Linda had insisted the pregnancy would make the inheritance legally dangerous if the child existed before the estate stabilized. And hearing my unborn daughter reduced to a strategic liability made something inside me permanently detach from the man standing in front of me. True manipulation is inherited long before it is consciously practiced, and certain families pass psychological cruelty through generations with the same obsessive care they use to preserve wealth and social prestige. 2 days after the DNA hearing, Claire's investigators completed a deeper review into Linda, Harper's financial history, and discovered that she had quietly transferred nearly $600,000 between shell consulting entities during the months following Thomas Caldwell's death. The records formed a disturbing network connecting private investigators, estate research consultants, and a media strategist previously employed by Silva Public Relations Group. Claire spread the documents across her office conference table while the late afternoon sunlight turned the pages gold like evidence displayed inside a museum of corruption. Every transfer aligned perfectly with the timeline of Derek's growing hostility toward me. Every consultation occurred shortly before a new escalation in the campaign to isolate me financially and emotionally. And buried inside the records was a single encrypted invoice labeled beneficiary destabilization assessment, a phrase so coldly corporate that it momentarily made my stomach twist with physical nausea. Claire explained that Linda had effectively orchestrated a covert operation designed to pressure me into either abandoning the inheritance or destabilizing psychologically before formal probate confirmation occurred. I stared at the invoice while realizing that my marriage had not collapsed from emotional failure. It had been strategically dismantled by people who viewed human relationships as negotiable financial instruments. Fear becomes uniquely dangerous when it arrives quietly instead of violently, because silence forces the human imagination to construct horrors far worse than direct confrontation ever could. I returned to Jess's apartment after sunset carrying takeout containers and legal folders while a cold March storm rolled across Atlanta with violent sheets of rain striking the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. Jess had stayed late at work, which meant the apartment was unusually silent except for the ticking radiator and distant thunder. I locked the door behind me and immediately sensed something subtly wrong in the atmosphere. Nothing obvious had been moved. Nothing appeared stolen. Yet the air carried the unmistakable psychological pressure of recent intrusion. I checked the bedroom and found my notebook lying open on the desk, exactly where I never left it. The final written page containing only 4 words circled repeatedly in black ink. "You should have settled." My pulse accelerated so violently that I could hear blood rushing through my ears as I backed slowly toward the kitchen and grabbed my phone to call Claire. But before I pressed the screen, my eyes drifted toward the balcony door, where a shadowed silhouette stood motionless beyond the rain-covered glass, watching me from the darkness. And although the figure disappeared before police arrived, the message had already accomplished its purpose. Someone wanted me terrified enough to abandon the case before discovery reached the final financial disclosures. The modern world records nearly every act of intimidation. Yet powerful people continue believing their influence exempts them from technological accountability. The apartment security footage arrived the following morning through the building management office, and Claire insisted we review it immediately before forwarding copies to law enforcement. The grainy black and white recording showed a hooded individual entering the building through the underground parking garage shortly after midnight using an electronic keycard that had been cloned from a resident access pass. The intruder moved directly toward Jess's apartment floor with disturbing confidence, as though they already knew the layout intimately. But the true shock arrived when the figure briefly lowered their hood while entering the stairwell, revealing not Derek Harper but Stuart Pell's legal assistant, Melissa Granger, a woman who had attended nearly every mediation session since the beginning of the divorce proceedings. Claire paused the footage and stared at the screen with the calm intensity of someone recognizing career-ending evidence unfolding in real time. Because if Derek's legal team had participated in witness intimidation and unlawful entry during active litigation, the consequences would devastate not only the divorce settlement, but potentially Stuart Pell's entire law practice. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I watched the balance of fear shift away from me and settle heavily onto the people who had engineered my destruction. Courtrooms do not operate on morality or emotional truth. They operate on documentation, timing, and whichever side maintains composure while exposing the contradictions hidden beneath polished professional performances. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Monday morning inside Fulton County Superior Court, after Claire filed motions regarding intimidation, unlawful surveillance, and misconduct connected to opposing counsel. Reporters had already begun gathering near the courthouse steps because rumors surrounding Thomas Caldwell's inheritance and Derek Harper's financial transfers were quietly circulating through Atlanta's business community. I wore a navy maternity dress beneath a long ivory coat while cameras flashed aggressively against the gray morning sky. Derek arrived separately beside Stuart Pell, whose face looked visibly strained beneath the fluorescent lobby lights. Inside the courtroom, Claire presented the apartment footage with ruthless precision while the judge watched, the screen expressionless except for a slight tightening around his eyes when Melissa Granger appeared clearly identifiable entering the building. Stuart attempted to argue independent action unrelated to the legal team, but the explanation collapsed almost instantly under questioning, because phone records confirmed 23 calls between Melissa and Derek during the 48 hours before the intrusion. And when the judge announced that sanctions and professional conduct investigations would proceed immediately, Derek closed his eyes briefly as though finally understanding that the carefully engineered machine designed to isolate me had begun consuming itself from the inside. Human vulnerability becomes terrifyingly clear when the body suddenly interrupts the illusion of strategic control and reminds you that survival itself cannot be postponed for legal warfare. 3 hours after leaving the courthouse, I collapsed in the parking garage beneath Claire's office with sharp abdominal pain that radiated through my lower back like electrical fire. Jess drove me to Northside Hospital through rush-hour traffic while rain hammered against the windshield hard enough to erase the skyline beyond the highway barriers. The emergency maternity unit smelled of antiseptic and overheated air conditioning as nurses connected monitors across my stomach, while doctors checked for signs of stress-induced complications. I lay beneath harsh white lights listening to the rapid heartbeat of my unborn daughter echo through the examination room speakers, a sound so small and impossibly determined that tears finally escaped my control for the first time in weeks. The doctor informed me that the baby remained stable, but warned that prolonged psychological stress was placing dangerous pressure on my pregnancy. Jess squeezed my hand beside the hospital bed, while quietly reminding me that surviving this mattered more than winning it. And for several long minutes, I stared at the ceiling, realizing how close I had come to allowing Derek and Linda's campaign to destroy not only my marriage, but the fragile new life growing inside me. Secrets rarely remain buried forever because the individuals responsible for concealment inevitably preserve fragments of their own guilt. Gordon Reeves contacted me 2 days after the hospital visit and explained that his office had uncovered additional archived correspondence belonging to Thomas Caldwell during the final year before his death. Among the files was a private voice recording stored alongside revisions to the trust agreement. I listened to the audio alone late that night while Atlanta traffic murmured faintly beyond Jess's apartment balcony. Thomas's voice sounded older than I remembered, yet unmistakably calm as he explained that he had become increasingly concerned after receiving unusual inquiries regarding my location and financial status from unidentified intermediaries connected to Atlanta real estate firms. He admitted that he initially dismissed the inquiries as harmless corporate networking until discovering that one investigator had attempted to access sealed probate projections connected to his estate planning. Thomas stated clearly that if anything happened to him unexpectedly, he wanted substantial resources placed directly into my control because he feared certain people viewed me as financially exploitable through marriage. Hearing a dead man describe the danger surrounding me months before Derek expelled me from our home felt like standing inside a nightmare, where every unanswered question had quietly predicted itself long before I recognized the pattern. Corporate empires survive on confidence more than actual stability, and once investors begin associating leadership with scandal, loyalty evaporates with astonishing speed. Derek's commercial real estate firm scheduled an emergency shareholder meeting after several private partners threatened withdrawal following publicity surrounding the court sanctions and intimidation allegations. Financial blogs across Atlanta had begun dissecting the divorce proceedings with brutal fascination because wealthy men destroying pregnant wives while pursuing inheritance access creates irresistible public outrage. Claire received leaked internal communications showing that senior executives inside Derek's company were pressuring him to temporarily step aside in order to limit reputational damage before quarterly negotiations concluded. Meanwhile, Linda intensified her attempts to regain control by contacting mutual acquaintances and spreading carefully edited narratives portraying me as emotionally unstable due to pregnancy hormones, and grief over Thomas Caldwell's death. But the strategy failed catastrophically once reporters obtained the DNA findings, proving Derek's accusations false from the beginning. And watching the social machinery that once protected the Harper family suddenly recoil against them felt disturbingly similar to observing a massive skyscraper develop visible structural cracks moments before collapse. Certain truths emerge only after powerful people recognize they are no longer capable of controlling the narrative surrounding their own actions. Derek requested a final private meeting through Claire, claiming he wanted to discuss settlement terms without attorneys present. Against Claire's recommendation, I agreed under the condition that the conversation occur in a public restaurant near Piedmont Park during daylight hours. He arrived looking dramatically older than the man who once stood beside me inside our kitchen, accusing me of carrying another man's child. The expensive precision of his appearance had deteriorated into visible exhaustion, as though weeks of collapsing pressure had physically hollowed him from the inside. After several minutes of silence, he finally admitted that Linda initiated the investigation into Thomas Caldwell after discovering rumors about the tech acquisition through one of her social contacts in Chicago. Derek claimed he originally intended only to confirm whether any inheritance existed, but became increasingly consumed by fear once he realized the possible scale of the estate. He confessed that Linda repeatedly insisted I would eventually leave him after gaining independent wealth, and that securing control before probate finalized was the only rational solution. I listened without interruption while understanding something deeply tragic about the man across from me. Derek had not destroyed our marriage because he hated me. He destroyed it because greed and fear had gradually replaced every remaining piece of his moral structure until nothing recognizable remained. Beneath the surface, isolation becomes strangely addictive after prolonged betrayal because silence feels safer than intimacy once trust has been weaponized against you repeatedly. The first inheritance disbursement transferred into my newly established private accounts during the second week of April, and Claire immediately insisted I relocate into secure, temporary housing until the divorce finalized completely. I rented a furnished penthouse overlooking Midtown Atlanta where the floor-to-ceiling windows reflected endless layers of city lights across polished black marble floors. Despite the luxury surrounding me, the apartment felt emotionally sterile, like a high-end hotel designed for someone else's life. Every evening, I sat alone near the glass balcony doors, listening to distant sirens and wondering how quickly ordinary happiness can transform into psychological warfare when money enters the equation. The nursery sketches for my daughter remained spread across the dining table beside legal folders and estate documents, while thunder rolled through the skyline beyond the windows. And although I finally possessed enough financial security to disappear from every person who had ever harmed me, I realized with unsettling clarity that wealth alone could never reconstruct the emotional architecture Derek and Linda deliberately demolished. The most terrifying evidence is often the material powerful people never expected anyone outside their circle to discover. Claire arranged a meeting with a former private investigator employed briefly by Linda Harper during the early stages of the inheritance inquiry, after he contacted her office requesting immunity cooperation. The man arrived carrying 2 thick binders filled with surveillance invoices, travel receipts, and psychological profiling reports compiled about me over nearly 11 months. According to his testimony, Linda specifically requested assessments regarding my emotional resilience, financial literacy, and likelihood of remaining dependent within the marriage if suddenly isolated from shared resources. One report described me as empathetic, conflict avoidant, and professionally vulnerable during periods of emotional instability. Language so coldly clinical that reading it felt like dissecting my own humanity through the perspective of predators studying prey. Buried deeper inside the files was evidence that Linda had considered arranging fabricated infidelity allegations months before my pregnancy announcement accelerated the timeline unexpectedly. The investigator admitted he withdrew from the operation after concluding the Harper family intended to manufacture psychological pressure severe enough to destabilize my legal credibility before probate finalized. And as Claire organized the documents into evidence folders, I finally understood that the campaign against me had been far more extensive than even I originally feared. Modern scandal no longer unfolds privately because digital media converts personal catastrophe into public entertainment within hours of exposure. A national business outlet published an investigative article detailing the harassment allegations, DNA findings, and inheritance dispute surrounding Derek Harper's divorce 3 days after the investigator cooperated with Claire's office. The headline spread across financial news platforms with brutal efficiency, while social media users dissected every available court filing searching for additional details. Satellite trucks gathered outside Derek's company headquarters downtown, while investors demanded emergency statements regarding leadership stability. Meanwhile, anonymous accounts online circulated photographs of me leaving medical appointments, accompanied by grotesque speculation about my pregnancy and finances. Jess attempted to shield me from the worst of the coverage, but the internet transforms human suffering into spectacle with terrifying speed once public fascination ignites. Late that evening, I stood alone beside the penthouse windows watching helicopters move across the Atlanta skyline, while notifications flooded endlessly across my phone screen. And for the first time since this began, I truly understood the irreversible cost of becoming the center of a narrative larger than private pain. People who manipulate others for decades often believe themselves emotionally indestructible, until reality finally removes every remaining illusion of control simultaneously. Linda Harper suffered what newspapers later described as an anxiety-related medical episode during a private fundraising gala at the Atlanta Botanical Gardens after several attendees confronted her publicly regarding the investigation article. Witnesses reported that she attempted maintaining composure while donors quietly distanced themselves throughout the evening until one longtime acquaintance directly questioned whether she orchestrated the campaign against her pregnant daughter-in-law. Linda reportedly dropped her champagne glass and collapsed moments later beneath the garden pavilion lights while musicians continued performing nearby, unaware that Atlanta social royalty was disintegrating in front of them. Derek called me from the hospital later that night, sounding emotionally shattered as he explained that doctors expected her to recover physically, but warned that severe stress and prolonged anxiety had destabilized her cardiovascular condition significantly. I listened silently while experiencing no satisfaction whatsoever because despite everything Linda had done, witnessing another human being consumed by the consequences of their own cruelty felt unbearably tragic rather than victorious. Grief frequently reveals itself through words never intended for public discovery, because hidden writing preserves emotional honesty that spoken performance cannot sustain. Rachel Caldwell mailed me a package containing several personal items recovered from Thomas's Oregon home after probate archivists completed their inventory process. Among the photographs and notebooks rested an unopened envelope addressed simply to Megan. If life becomes difficult again. The paper carried Thomas's familiar slanted handwriting and faint traces of cedar, cologne that instantly transported me backward. Through years, I believed emotionally inaccessible forever. Inside the letter, Thomas admitted that he regretted allowing ambition and emotional exhaustion to quietly dissolve our marriage without fighting harder for honesty between us. He explained that after the acquisition transformed his company into something cold and corporate. He spent years recognizing how rare genuine trust had become in his world. And near the end of the final page, he wrote a sentence that left me crying silently against the kitchen counter long after midnight. Money only reveals what people were already willing to become. A truth so devastatingly accurate that it felt less like advice, and more like the final architectural beam holding together the ruins of everything that had happened since February. Settlement negotiations resemble controlled demolitions because every concession removes another structural support until only the unavoidable framework remains standing. The final mediation session occurred inside a private conference center overlooking Centennial Olympic Park, while storm clouds gathered over Atlanta's skyline like bruises spreading slowly across concrete. Claire arrived carrying 6 organized binders filled with financial disclosures, intimidation evidence, and witness affidavits, while Stuart Pell appeared visibly diminished beneath weeks of professional scrutiny and possible disciplinary review. Derek entered last, wearing a dark blue suit that hung loosely across his shoulders, as though stress itself had physically reduced him. The negotiations extended nearly 7 hours, covering property division, custody arrangements, investment liquidation schedules, and formal recognition of Thomas Caldwell's inheritance as permanently protected separate property. Every attempt by Derek's team to reduce financial accountability collapsed once Claire referenced the discovery evidence proving coordinated manipulation and marital asset dissipation. Shortly before sunset, Derek finally signed the revised agreement with trembling hands while thunder rolled across the city beyond the conference room windows. And although the legal war technically ended in that moment, I realized no document could fully measure the emotional destruction greed had carved through all our lives. Certain buildings retain emotional residue long after the people inside them destroy each other completely. Several weeks after the settlement finalized, I returned alone to the suburban house north of Atlanta that once represented the polished illusion of my marriage. The neighborhood looked unchanged. beneath the soft heat of early summer while sprinklers sprayed across immaculate lawns and children rode bicycles through quiet streets completely unaware of the devastation hidden behind closed doors. Inside the house, dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon light cutting across empty furniture outlines where our shared life once existed. I walked slowly through the kitchen where Derek accused me of carrying another man's child and felt an eerie detachment as though I were touring a museum dedicated to someone else's emotional collapse. Upstairs, the nursery we once discussed creating remained untouched, except for pale paint samples still taped beside the window frame. I stood there listening to silence fill the hollow rooms while recognizing that the structure itself had never betrayed me. People had. And understanding that distinction allowed me to finally walk out the front door without carrying the psychological weight of the past behind me. Life possesses a brutal instinct for continuing forward, regardless of how much emotional destruction precedes it. Labor began unexpectedly during a violent July thunderstorm, while rain hammered against the penthouse windows hard enough to blur the entire Atlanta skyline into silver abstraction. Jess drove me through flooded streets toward Northside Hospital, while contractions tore through my body with overwhelming intensity that reduced every legal battle. Inheritance document and betrayal into meaningless background noise compared to the immediate physical reality of bringing another human being into existence. The maternity ward glowed beneath harsh fluorescent lights, while nurses moved rapidly through corridors carrying blankets and medical trays as thunder rattled the building overhead. After 14 exhausting hours, my daughter finally arrived, screaming furiously into the world with dark eyes wide open and tiny fists clenched against the cold hospital air. The nurse placed her against my chest while dawn slowly emerged beyond the rain-soaked windows, and for several suspended seconds, everything else disappeared completely. There were no courtrooms, no settlements, no inheritance wars, only the unbearable, miraculous certainty that despite every calculated attempt to destroy us, we had survived. Forgiveness and accountability rarely coexist comfortably, because emotional wounds do not disappear simply because legal agreements demand cooperation. Derek met his daughter for the first time 2 weeks after her birth inside a supervised family visitation office arranged temporarily through our custody attorneys. He entered carrying a small stuffed elephant and wearing an expression so emotionally fractured that I barely recognized the man who once controlled entire boardrooms with cold precision. Ellie slept quietly in my arms beneath the soft yellow lighting, while Derek sat across from me, struggling visibly to maintain composure. When I finally placed her carefully into his hands, something extraordinary happened to his face. The defensive corporate armor that had defined him for months dissolved instantly into raw human vulnerability, as tears escaped down his cheeks before he could stop them. He whispered apologies that sounded less like strategic statements and more like someone mourning the ruins of the person he used to believe himself capable of being. I watched silently while understanding that fatherhood had arrived too late to save our marriage, but perhaps not too late to salvage whatever fragments of decency still remained inside him. The rebuilding of a human life does not occur through dramatic triumph or cinematic revenge. It happens slowly through ordinary moments where fear gradually loses its authority over your future. 8 months after the divorce finalized, I purchased a modern house in Decatur, filled with natural light and broad oak floors, where Ellie's laughter echoed warmly through open rooms each morning. My architectural practice expanded steadily after several independent developers approached me privately expressing admiration for how I survived the Harper scandal without surrendering my professional identity. Jess visited constantly carrying coffee and impossible amounts of baby toys, while Claire occasionally joined us for dinners that no longer involved legal strategy or emergency hearings. Sometimes during quiet evenings, after Ellie falls asleep, I sit alone on the back porch, listening to cicadas hum beneath the Georgia night sky and think about the woman who once trembled inside a Kroger parking lot, believing her entire life had ended. She could not yet see the future waiting beyond the collapse. She did not understand that certain structures must fail completely before stronger foundations can finally be built. But I understand it now. And every morning when my daughter reaches toward me with absolute trust, shining inside her dark, curious eyes, I know with complete certainty that the people who tried to destroy me ultimately created the conditions that forced me to discover my own worth. The collapse of a manipulative strategy becomes psychologically catastrophic for the architect of the deception when verified reality begins dismantling every carefully maintained illusion of authority at once. Derek Harper arrived at the March deposition wearing a charcoal gray suit that had once projected executive confidence inside Atlanta commercial real estate circles, but now hung stiffly across his shoulders like ceremonial armor already cracked beyond repair. Claire Sutton placed the printed discovery documents across the polished Conference table one page at a time with the deliberate patience of someone dismantling a structure brick by brick while sunlight spilled through the tall Buckhead office windows and illuminated every visible tremor in Derek's clenched hands. The forensic timeline extracted from his work laptop established conclusively that he had begun researching Thomas Caldwell's estate nearly 11 months before throwing me out of the marital home. Browser histories revealed repeated searches regarding inheritance trusts, beneficiary rights during active marriages, and financial shielding strategies designed to minimize spousal exposure before estate distribution events. Linda Harper's subpoenaed phone records documented multiple lengthy calls to Thomas's sister Rachel immediately after his death, while Derek's personal emails confirmed active conversations, with attorney Stuart Pell discussing how to resolve the situation before Portland attorneys made contact. The room grew progressively colder beneath the silence that followed each revelation because no one present could continue pretending this had been an emotionally impulsive marital breakdown. It had been a coordinated financial operation constructed around the assumption that fear and isolation would force me into surrender long before evidence surfaced publicly. Derek attempted repeatedly to avoid direct answers by claiming memory, failures, and legal ambiguity until Claire finally slid the prenatal DNA results across the table, proving with scientific certainty that he had knowingly expelled his pregnant wife from their shared home using fabricated accusations of infidelity. And in the exact second Derek lowered his eyes away from mine for the first time since the nightmare began, I understood something irreversible. Manipulative people survive by controlling narratives, but collapse the moment objective documentation becomes stronger than their performance. Real legal victories are rarely cinematic because institutional destruction usually unfolds through signatures, financial disclosures, and exhausted negotiations conducted beneath fluorescent lighting while reputations quietly bleed to death behind closed doors. Derek's attorney requested emergency settlement mediation less than 2 weeks after the deposition concluded, because the accumulation of evidence surrounding asset dissipation, intimidation attempts, fraudulent accusations, and coordinated inheritance concealment had created catastrophic exposure that threatened not only the divorce proceedings but Derek's broader commercial credibility among investors and lenders across Georgia's development sector. Claire negotiated with terrifying precision over 3 consecutive 12-hour sessions, while I sat beside her listening to the gradual disintegration of the leverage Derek once believed he controlled absolutely. The final agreement transferred 60% of all marital holdings into my ownership, including the suburban Atlanta property, multiple investment portfolios, and substantial equity positions connected to Derek's smaller commercial projects. Every conceivable future claim against Thomas Caldwell's $77 million trust was permanently extinguished, while additional language formally recognized the inheritance as protected separate property entirely inaccessible to Derek under any future circumstance. The settlement also required immediate reimbursement of the $31,000 Derek had transferred out of the joint account the night he expelled me from the house, together with accrued penalties and legal costs associated with the emergency injunction proceedings. Perhaps most importantly, the non-disclosure agreement disappeared entirely after Claire refused categorically to silence documented abuse in exchange for financial convenience. Derek signed the final documents with visible exhaustion carved across his face, while Linda sat rigidly beside him, radiating the cold fury of someone watching decades of strategic control collapse under verified evidence she could no longer manipulate. And as the court clerk stamped the finalized settlement packet, I realized that survival is not merely escaping destruction. It is forcing the people who engineered your suffering to witness the full permanence of your recovery. Human grief becomes strangely physical once betrayal vacates the rooms where love once pretended to exist, because silence preserves emotional residue more efficiently than conflict ever could. I returned alone to the 4-bedroom suburban house, north of Atlanta, 3 days after the settlement finalized, carrying only a small overnight bag while pale afternoon sunlight stretched across the empty driveway, where I had once believed family life would eventually unfold safely. Derek had already removed most of his belongings, leaving behind scattered fragments of a life now dismantled beyond reconstruction, including expensive suits forgotten inside the master closet, half-empty whiskey bottles near the downstairs bar, and business files abandoned carelessly across the office desk, where he once calculated property acquisitions while secretly researching the inheritance connected to my dead first husband. The entire structure felt emotionally hollow beneath the silence, as though the walls themselves had grown exhausted from sustaining years of concealed manipulation and performative domestic stability. I moved slowly from room to room, while Ellie shifted gently beneath my coat inside my growing body, reminding me that destruction and creation frequently coexist within the same season of human existence. When I finally opened the safe hidden behind the master bedroom painting, I discovered something entirely unexpected, resting alone inside the darkness. Thomas Caldwell's original emerald engagement ring, preserved carefully inside a velvet box beside a handwritten note dated several weeks before his death. The message contained only one sentence written in steady, deliberate handwriting. "You deserved honesty more than permanence." And standing there in the collapsing remains of my marriage while evening shadows spread gradually across the bedroom floor, I finally allowed myself to grieve not merely the betrayal Derek inflicted, but the years I spent explaining away, emotional absences because loving someone had taught me to distrust my own instincts. Memory possesses an almost architectural persistence because unresolved emotional truths continue existing silently beneath the surface of ordinary life until one precise moment exposes the entire hidden structure at once. Several weeks after the settlement concluded, Gordon Reeves contacted me from Portland, explaining that Thomas Caldwell had left behind sealed personal correspondence intended for delivery, only after all inheritance disputes fully resolved. I opened the envelope late at night while sitting alone on the back porch of my newly purchased Decatur home as soft Georgia rain drifted through the darkness surrounding the unfinished garden and distant thunder rolled across the city skyline. Thomas's handwriting appeared remarkably calm despite the knowledge that he composed the letter only months before the stroke that ultimately ended his life. He admitted with painful honesty that our marriage failed not because affection disappeared, but because ambition, timing, and emotional immaturity gradually transformed us into incompatible versions of ourselves, chasing entirely different definitions of fulfillment. After selling his software company, he spent years reconsidering the simplicity of our early life together and eventually realized I had been the only person who ever loved him without evaluating his financial potential or strategic usefulness. The inheritance itself he described not as repayment or guilt, but as protection, a safeguard designed to ensure that no future circumstance could ever trap me financially inside another manipulative relationship again. By the time I reached the final paragraphs, tears blurred the ink beneath the porch light, while Ellie moved softly inside me and warm rain touched the wooden deck surrounding my chair. Thomas ended the letter by writing that structural honesty was the rarest form of love he had ever encountered in another human being. And as I pressed the paper against my chest beneath the storm-darkened sky, I understood that some relationships survive death more truthfully than they ever survived life.